This is American Government, Friday, September 25th, 2020. A reminder that on Monday we'll have our second midterm that will cover the preparation and review questions on the Constitution from last week and on federalism from this week. We'll begin next week, by the way, turning to Congress. And again, the rest of the course will essentially follow the institutions of national government through the end of the course. Today, following up and finishing up with the issue of federalism and the division of authority between the local and the national governments, we'll see, as Wilson suggested in Chapter 3, that this long-standing question of the division of authority and proper role of the federal and the state government, or the national and the state governments and localities, not only was the first great controversy, in some ways it's at the heart of even the intense controversies facing our nation today, as we'll see. Now, on Monday, we looked at the arguments for vibrant and effective local and state government on the grounds of participation and involvement in community affairs and attachment to the government as part of the Republican or popular principle. We also looked at the argument for a strong, concentrated national government presented by Hamilton in Federalist 11. And on Wednesday, we looked at McCulloch v. Maryland and the Lincoln-Douglas debates to see how and for what reasons the interests and power of the national government should preside over the states when the interests of the whole are at stake and when the fundamental rights of Americans are at stake. Today, we'll conclude by looking at the arguments for the states and localities against the backdrop of modern politics and the issues of modern life. In some ways, the argument is perhaps why might it be beneficial for our country to strengthen and fortify the institutions of local and state government, both as goods in themselves, but also as responses to modern issues. The two authors we're looking at, in addition to Wilson Chapter 3, which we'll come back to for some summary statements about the way that federalism has developed over the years and how federalism works out on a practical level, are Robert Putnam and William Schambra. Now, Robert Putnam was not a conservative, and his interesting book, Bowling Alone, chronicles certain tendencies in American life over the last generation. William Schambra is a political conservative, actually was a friend of mine at graduate school, and as you'll see, the reason I'm using his article is not only because he makes the argument for strengthened local and state governments and more local autonomy, but also, as you'll see, I think that his argument, his article shows that in some ways the different emphases about strengthening national government or strengthening local government is in some ways still at the heart of the difference between the two parties at this point in time, as we'll see when we take his article and take a look at it. And we'll finish again with considering some historical and present aspects of the way federalism works and some of the current issues facing the country today. Again, Putnam's interesting book was Bowling Alone. In it, he chronicles what he considers to be a problematic tendency in American society, especially in the last 50 years, a tendency towards the diminishing of the strength of social connections and even family connections in the direction of a kind of a greater individualism, that people are less involved in each other's lives as measured not only by social habits such as more people bowling alone rather than bowling in leagues or in groups, but even the diminishing of social organizations like the Elks and the Moose and other kinds of social organizations that were really quite prominent. And in some ways, the kind of sense of personal alienation. The way he measures this is what he calls diminished social capital. And social capital is an interesting concept among sociologists, which is really what Putnam's orientation is as a sociologist. And what social capital is the reserve of good habits and dispositions among the citizens to benefit each other and the community. Sort of like when the power goes out, to make sure that everyone doesn't go around screaming and fighting with each other, but rather if people have a sense of social connectedness, that even in times of crisis, this might come forward, and even if the authority around us should fail, that our reserve of good disposition towards each other might actually hold up a sense of citizenship and belonging to community. Now, why is it then that American connectedness and the social capital has diminished in the last couple of generations, according to Putnam? The answer is complex and perhaps irreversible. He speaks about the women's movement, not to criticize the women's movement, but the argument that many aspects of family life have been weakened as more people entered the workforce and sort of um, diminished the kinds of family bonds that had been the grounds of many Americans' lives up to this point of time. Perhaps a weakening of religion, mobility. There's no question that Americans, especially after World War II, with the rise of the interstate highway system and the rise of air flights, etc., Americans became more mobile and the American economy became more naturalized. I remember I moved to the South in 1986, and as I've watched the South unfold over the last couple of decades, there's no question, for instance, that the South of all parts of America were probably the most locality oriented, and where birth and family and connection was a higher priority for people, but that in some ways has diminished too. So we have a national economy, mobility, and even technology. Now, Putnam wrote this article, of course, in his book in the 90s, um, and has revised it. But in some ways, you'd have to say that perhaps there's some truth to this, that the rise of virtual reality and social media have actually not connected people more, which was initially the promise of social media. And I don't deny that in some respects that may happen. But on the other hand, it might have also increased people's sense of loneliness and isolation, and that virtual reality ultimately is not the same thing as actual reality. So Putnam suggests that perhaps one, not solution, again, some of these tendencies may be endemic in modern life, or modern American life, but one possibility is to awaken the possibility for participation in local government and community by actually allowing more important decisions to be exercised on that level. That somehow might draw people out of their living rooms and into public life on a local level in a way that simple participation in national politics can't. Now, this might seem utopian, and it might not be able to meet the actual challenges of the forces that he describes, but nevertheless, it does harken back to that old argument that Sentinel and Jefferson and even Alexis de Tocqueville make, that strong local community actually does draw people out, connect with their individual lives to the communal lives around them in a way that no national community can. Now, Bill Schambra um, argues that in some ways, reawakening the possibility of local autonomy and genuine power over issues in our immediate lives might actually awaken a new sense of citizenship and empowerment. We'll come back to that at the end of today's discussion, too, because there may be some evidence for that, even very controversial evidence. Now, Schambra actually suggests that our lives as Americans hovers between a commitment to the national community, where, and we'll see why, and that this is generally embodied in what people who are progressive or liberal or adhere to the Democratic Party, the kind of vision of American life that they would support, as opposed to Republicans or conservatives who would argue a different vision of what American life consists of. The Democrats and liberals and progressives, according to Schambra, focus on the national community, and Republicans and conservatives have a tendency to focus on today on the local community and the private sphere, as opposed to the kind of centralized and nationalized vision of the American community on the national level. That in some ways, and Schambra is correct about this, goes back to the rise of the progressive movement at the turn of the century, which became embodied in the New Deal vision of America as essentially a national community of national provision and national personal rights. Now, of course, Schambra doesn't argue against personal liberty and personal rights. The question is, what kind of community are we most Americans? And you could say the argument for the national community relies both on certain assumptions about where we are most American and where the moral underpinnings of American life are, and also, as you'll see, hovers on the issue of responsibility. So if you're looking at the notes, we'll go down the left side of the column, and see the argument for why Americans have turned to the national community since, again, the progressive movement at the turn of the century, and essentially the rise of New Deal liberalism and the Great Society programs of the 1960s. The argument is, again, is that in the national community is where we are most Americans. That's where rights means the natural and civil guarantees that we enjoy in American life, and that should be secured and guaranteed by the national government. In some ways, the suggestion is as Americans claiming rights, the role of the national community is to provide us what we need. And the advantages of that community are a certain uniformity, as we saw with Lincoln Douglas debates on Wednesday. That if you say, well, this right is a fundamental right of all Americans, then all Americans should enjoy it uniformly and equally, efficiently, and of course, as we've seen, it's with the national government, especially with the rise of the income tax at the turn of the century, that and because of the national government's ability to coin money and to borrow in a way that the states cannot, that in some ways the national government concentrates more of our resources. This, for instance, is the primary argument for a nationalized health care. On the other side, Schambra chronicles the argument on the part of Republicans or conservatives that it's in the local community that we actually live our lives and who we really are on a daily basis. The underpinnings of this kind of understanding of strengthening the local community is that here that rights means not so much claiming what we might from the national government, but the rights means to live our own lives as we would structure them and in the communities as we fashion them. In some ways, the moral underpinning of rights is this understanding is not provide us what we need, secure our rights in that sense, but leave us alone to live our own lives in the light of our personal freedom and our community. Here, the accent is on the diversity and on local needs, sort of reflecting back to Sentinel's original argument that we saw on Monday, and that liberty means not so much being left alone or having the government provide your essential needs, but rather a kind of form of self-government. That liberty in this sense means the right to structure your own lives and to take the risk of structuring your own lives. Here, the accent again is on participation and self-reliance. So the argument is on this local and state community, Schambra suggests, we may actually discover that participation in the communities around us on issues of schools, and as we'll see, policing, and even on issues of health and community, that it's the local community that deserves more accentuation and more influence. That certainly is Schambra's argument. And the suggestion is that by leaving more decisions to the state and local communities, that Americans might actually increase their sense of personal liberty, not so much because their rights are provided for, but because they participate in a community around them that actually requires their attention and draws them out of their private sphere. So in some ways, and Schambra sees that on issues such as schooling, and that's why he would support school vouchers, because he believes that this actually involves parents in structuring the lives of their children in terms of the educational function. So let's conclude this section with a kind of summary from Wilson chapter 3 of what this issue really is, how it's changed over the decades, and how it works out in our lives today. Remember that the framers tried to create a new kind of federalism. As we saw when we went back to the founding, this question of dividing the authority between the national and state governments, not between a sovereign nation and dependent local units, or sovereign state or local units with a weak central government, but a new kind of federalism where the American people actually divide their sovereignty between a supreme but limited national government, that was the framers' vision, and yet with vibrant and important centers of genuine autonomy and semi-sovereignty. Again, remember, this new federalism is both interesting and difficult at the same time because it seems to do what can't be done, to divide sovereignty. Yet that's exactly what the framers tried to do, and as we've seen, this has been the vehicle of almost all important and controversial issues in American life up to the very present day, as we'll see. So, in some ways, the whole point of McCulloch v. Maryland, and I think this was the ideal of the framers, was that the United States, when it came to the interests of the whole, as we saw, and fundamental rights of Americans, the national government and the national community would have a supremacy. So finding the right amount of local autonomy and state semi-sovereignty has been in some ways the issue throughout American history. To go over some of the historical developments that Wilson talks about, just to make sure that we understand them, and how we arrived at where we are today at the interesting and complex mix of federal and state responsibilities. Really going back to the very beginning, one of the issues has been just how autonomous can the states be? And probably the most interesting issue in this question up through the Civil War was the doctrine of nullification, the idea that states could nullify federal laws that they considered unconstitutional. And you'd have to say that in some ways, McCulloch v. Maryland suggests that nullification is not a proper or tenable doctrine within the American federal system. Yet, states and localities have resorted to it in order to resist federal authority, going all the way back to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions discussed by Wilson in Chapter 3, to the attempt on the part of southern states to nullify certain treaties, tariffs, and tax laws of the United States. And even you could say the idea of secession, which is a kind of a version of nullification that is extreme. And as Wilson kind of soberly points out, that doctrine was put to rest in some ways by the Civil War, in which the authority of the national government was asserted by military means ultimately. Now, you'll see that this idea, the idea that there's still residual sovereignty in the part of states and localities to resist the national government, hasn't completely gone away. It's resurfaced in some ways, interestingly enough, in the sanctuary movement among certain cities and states to resist the immigration policies of the national government. After the Civil War and the rise of a national economy, which began with industrialization and the rise of corporate capitalism in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you could say that the doctrine that tended to dominate on the Supreme Court in many parts of the nation was something called dual federalism. And the idea was that the spheres of action and the content of governance between the national government and the states were completely different. This especially surfaced in the attempt on the Supreme Court, which really began around the 1880s and 1890s and lasted up through the Great Depression, an attempt to find an absolute distinction between intrastate and interstate commerce, that those two were completely separate levels of action in government, and that states regulated completely internal commerce within their borders, local commerce, and that the national government could only regulate, as Article 1, Section 3 says, commerce among the states. You'd say that to some degree the Depression, which was, of course, was a national, the greatest economic emergency in the history of our nation, although perhaps we may be facing something equivalent to it now with the economic dislocations because of the pandemic and the different lockdowns. But you'd have to say that in some ways the nation abandoned the idea that there was this absolutely strict division between national government and state government when it came to commerce. And that, especially with the rise of a national economy, where it's very hard to point a simple limit, a point where local commerce leaves off and national commerce begins. I think most of us would admit that almost every aspect of our lives that deals with commerce in some ways is not only a question of the kind of an intermixture of local and national commerce, but even global commerce. So in some ways, you'd have to say that the idea of dual federalism really subsided or was even replaced with the Depression and really with World War II and the rise of the modern American post-World War II American economy with the idea of cooperative federalism. That the national government and the state governments can cooperate on certain issues. And then in some ways the question within that view of cooperative federalism, where especially the national government initiates and concentrates national funding and then disperses funding among the states and encourages states and localities to participate in national purposes. This kind of cooperative federalism has probably strengthened, of course, and especially in issues like in Social Security from the Depression and welfare regulation and economic regulation, and the rise of the interstate highway system, which is funded and partially directed by the national government, but also partially funded by the state governments, to Medicare and Medicaid and in the other great society programs in the 1960s. And what you have within this universe of cooperative federalism is a kind of an array of alternatives that span um, more federal funding and control, especially with categorical grants, where the United States government provides funding for certain programs um, uh, tied to very specific policy measures and goals. That's the kind of federal assistance to states and localities that has, you could say, the tightest strings, and where the national government almost directs states and localities how to affect or attain certain policies. And then, as you'll see in the 1980s and 90s, and even up until today, and going back to the Schambra article about the divisions between the two major parties, there has been more of an effort at devolution, where the national government reassigns to the states important aspects of policymaking and autonomy. And in some ways, the financial version of that has been block grants. Medicare and Medicaid medical assistance for the poor, and Medicare medical health care for the elderly has been an example of the programs where, to some degree, the federal government has and state governments have experimented with tighter and looser restraints. Now, in some ways, um, uh, this this last aspect of devolution is still, again, I think, as Schambra points out, um, in some ways, the major political policy difference between the two parties. And that, in some ways, you could say that as we're moving into the middle of the 21st century, it turns out that this question of finding the proper dividing line between the national government and the state authorities is still just as alive, just as contentious, and just as controversial as it was at the beginning of the Republic. Um, Look at the issues and the conflicts over policing, for instance, in the last year, or the conflicts as the pandemic unfolded, and the national versus state responses. In some ways, on both of these very contentious, as we can see from daily news, the issue often has to do with the policies and the regulations, both of the national government, but it turns out that that local and state views on these things and policies can matter just as much as the national government. So, um, in some ways, as we watch the controversies in our national life unfold in front of us, the interesting thing is this old issue of the new federalism is still at the heart of our national life. There's no easy answer, by the way, to at what point. There are some easy answers, you could say, when it comes to military policy or foreign affairs or international regulation. But even there are diverse opinions about how much autonomy local and state government should have in our country. But you'd have to say that this interesting aspect of the founding is still with us, and as it appears, will be with us for many years, if not decades, to come.